A Turned Page. Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Paris, France, August 29th, 1889. The footsteps of the solitary librarian echoed through the grand, expansive building. The public had been cleared from the wings of the library hours ago, and even her colleagues had retired for the evening, leaving her alone with her thoughts in the sprawling library. Arisanna Aubert did not mind the isolation. The texts around her were the only company she needed. The centuries' worth of books which lined the walls of the library guided them through the darkness more than the lantern clutched in their hand could ever hope to. These books were her friends, her constant companions in the lonely nights spent reorganizing the shelves and cases and chests. Her entire life had been dedicated to these texts, ancient and modern, French and foreign, and she was as much a part of the library as any tome which resided in its walls. Arisanna had always felt at home in the library. It was a palace of comfort, a beacon of safety to which they always returned. And yet tonight, for some reason she couldn't begin to place, she felt scared. The feeling clawed its way up from her heart and enveloped her in a blanket of unease. Arisanna found herself scared of the library. This wasn't the first time they had experienced these feelings. These bouts of paranoia within the walls of the Bibliothèque had become increasingly common in the last few months. Yet this particular sensation overcame her so suddenly and violently that the librarian was forced to pause in her walk, bracing themselves against the shelves as the lantern threatened to slip from their hand. Her vision swam as the invisible gaze of the library's dark halls settled on her shoulders. Every book turned its eyes towards her. Each volume, once so endearing to the young woman, now felt tinged with a demanding and judgmental air which threatened to crush the breath from her lungs. Arisanna felt her heart pound against her chest, her breathing becoming rapid as she struggled to focus on the task ahead of her. Her final job for the night before she could leave and rid herself of this inexplicable fear. All she had to do was make sure the archives had been cleaned of visitors, and then she was free to breathe the open air beyond the library's walls. Once, Arisanna had found the warm, musty smell of paper exhilarating, yet now, so deep in the halls of the expansive building, the air felt dry and suffocating, a maze-like tomb in which they found themselves trapped once again. There had always been legends about the building being haunted. Any old or significant building, especially in a city as turbulent and historical as Paris, is bound to accumulate such rumors. Arisanna had never believed them, of course. She was educated beyond most of her peers, and far from one to make such illogical leaps towards the supernatural. Ghosts did not, and could not, exist. She knew that, at her core. Tonight, however, in the silence of the library as she regathered her breath and allowed her sight to steady, Arisanna swore she heard whispering amongst the shelves, calling her deeper into the library and making her hair stand on end. She ignored the sensations and the paranoia. They delved deeper into the clutches of the archives. The task of making sure all the archive documents were stored correctly was for the most part idle busywork. It was rare that anyone ever delved this far into the library, and on the odd occasion someone did, those visiting had such reverence for the documents that they would never dare leave the place in a disorderly condition. Still, it was a job Arisanna couldn't simply ignore. Despite the moments of fear which had grasped her these last few months, she found herself connected to the library more than ever, drawn further into its embrace, more eager than ever to keep it orderly. For so many years, Arisanna had not wanted to leave the library when it was time to go home. She would find any excuse to stay later than necessary. Tonight, however, it was the library itself making excuses, holding her tightly and refusing to let her leave. There had only ever been one person, in all the years she had worked here, that Arisanna had seen leave the archives in a worse state than they'd found it. It was a visitor they found themselves coming back to again and again, their name constantly eluding her, and their face haunting her treks through the halls. A nebulous instigator of her problems she couldn't rid herself. The Englishman with the wild green eyes. When had he visited the library? May? June, perhaps? Surely it couldn't have been that long ago. She couldn't remember his name, and yet she could remember leading him through the various wings of the library. He had been a guest, they recalled. He was important in some way, and there had been a request sent from the British Museum for his entrance to the archives. He was studying some forgotten language which Arisanna had dragged from the depths of the shelves for him, gathering as much material on the indecipherable scrolls for him as she could, only for him to cast it aside late in the night. The man's arrival had been the start of the unsettling feelings. She was sure of it. It was the start of the constant sensations of being watched, the beginnings of the frequent whispers just beyond the shelves. Had the man done something to the library? It felt ridiculous to even consider, and yet Arisanna could find no other incident which may have caused these irrational sensations. The man had caused it. He must have. Whatever he had done in the archives had dragged forth some deep-seated horror within the darkness of the library, and now it had chosen Arisanna as the object of its ire. The librarian stepped into the manuscript room, half expecting something to emerge from the darkness and envelop her, waiting for her irrational fears to become realized. Only nothing was out of place. Nothing was waiting for her amongst the shelves. Everything was just as it should be, just as she had left it. A flicker of movement within the room caught their eye, and Arisanna jumped. They swung the lantern in front of them as they turned, hoping to catch the source of the movement in the light. Yet there was nothing. Just her, alone in the room. Hello? Arisanna's voice echoed in the catacomb-like halls of the library. Nothing responded. It was nothing, she muttered to herself. She had meant to comfort herself with the words, however, the moment the sound of her voice dissipated, the silence which had once been comforting was now obvious and oppressive. Arisanna began muttering to keep the silence at bay. Nothing at all, just my imagination. Just my own shadows and footsteps, and... There was more movement, and she let out an involuntary squeak. A shadow, they tried to rationalize. The movement had been their own shadow. For a moment, Arisanna's cheeks flooded with color as she scolded herself for feeling so foolish. Then slowly, realization crept along their spine. The only source of light in the room, in the entire library, was their own lantern. So what had cast the shadow? Arisanna wheeled around, staring into the darkness of the hallway. Beyond a distant bookshelf, peeking through the spines, a brilliant source of light flickered into view and quickly vanished. There was someone else in the library. Arisanna cycled through all the possibilities in their mind. The security guards, her co-workers, someone who had gotten lost before closing, a thief. One certainly seemed more likely, and more terrifying than the others. "Excuse me," Arisanna found herself saying without a second thought for her own safety. "I'm sorry, you can't be here." The light reappeared briefly, further beyond the books, and this time it was accompanied by the distant, almost inaudible whispering the librarian had heard so many times. Somewhere, deep within her mind, the sensible part of her mind told her to run. To drop her lantern and sprint for the exit as fast as her legs could carry her. To simply abandon the library and run. Instead, Arisanna followed the source of the light. The whispering became stronger as she delved deeper into the archives, the sound of voices upon voices layered over one another, frantically babbling in a language she didn't recognize as it grew louder in her ears. In the distance, the strange light would appear briefly and brightly down another hall, then another staircase, then behind another shelf, and Arisanna would follow. With every step, their own lantern grew dimmer and dimmer as the gas within it steadily burned away. I'll get the guards!" Arisanna yelled, her voice quivering as she spoke, each word punctuated by a heavy breath as she jogged down a spiral staircase in pursuit of the light. Her mind raced as her feet continued to move beneath her. Which staircase was this? Had she ever seen it before? She must have. She had been everywhere in the library. An entire staircase couldn't have simply appeared in the library overnight, and yet... Arisanna reached the bottom of the stairs and turned back to look at the staircase above her, trying to gauge her position in the library. Only the staircase wasn't there. Facing the librarian was simply a blank stone wall, moss gathering in its cracked and crumbling surface. What? No. Arisanna pressed her hands against the stones, the surface cold and damp beneath her palm, yet still completely stolid. There was nothing but the wall. There had only ever been the old limestone wall. No! They slammed their palms against the rocks, willing them to move and reveal a passage of some kind, and only managing to hurt her hand in the process. She cursed, bringing her arm into their chest as she turned to look around. She was alone in a small, tight passageway which led further into the shadows. In a final flicker of life, her lantern burned out, leaving Arisanna in total darkness. She didn't dare let herself scream, not when whatever was down here might hear her. For an agonizingly long few seconds, their minds struggled to grasp the situation at all. Was this where she was going to die? Some forgotten catacomb beneath the library she had spent so many years admiring, pouring her heart and soul into its care? Arisanna did not want to die. She most certainly did not want to die here. In front of them, blinding in the darkness, the light they had followed reappeared. Arisanna dropped the darkened lantern, her hands flying up to cover her eyes as the brightness burned into her vision. They blinked at the ball of brilliant white light, expecting it to soften into the shape of a figure or lantern the longer they looked at it. Only it didn't. It stayed as it was, a ball of light, bobbing gently in the darkness, flickering with wisps of blue smoke like dull flames in the inky depths of the tunnel. The ball of light vanished only for a moment, reappearing further away. Somewhere behind the light, another flickered to life, bouncing between the walls like an eager, fluttering bird. In a heartbeat, both lights extinguished. The whispering grew from the depths of the tunnel to echo around her, more and more voices beating into Arisanna's skull, excited and playful and frantic, like millions of children laughing on the distant, non-existent wind deep beneath the earth. Swallowing her own instincts for survival, Arisanna stepped deeper into the tunnel, following the direction the lights had once been. She had nowhere else to walk, no other path to the surface. All she could do was follow. The librarian lost track of how long she walked. On occasion, the lights would reappear, taunting her, leading her deeper into the tunnel, its ground sloping downwards into the earth and its walls constricting tighter and tighter until they were pressed against her shoulders. Whenever Arisanna made to turn back, her courage failing and the fear once again setting in, the stone wall had moved to meet her, trapping her within the tunnel. Her breathing was tight and tense, and her heartbeat pounded in her ears, the whispering voices of the lights almost inaudible beneath her own thundering terror. She was trapped, buried within the walls. Someday, she realized, they would find her bones, caught between these narrow stones wedged within the earth. She sobbed, the sound strangled by her tight lungs and muffled by the dirt beneath her feet. The air she breathed tasted of decay and rotting plants. The tears on her face were cold in the claustrophobic heat of her own breath. The walls which pressed against her shoulders crushed her ribs and made her hands go numb as the circulation was cut off from her arms. The lights had abandoned them, and they could no longer see how far the tunnel had to go on, or how tight it may become as they were squeezed tighter and tighter, thinner and thinner between the dank, cold walls. And then the stone opened up, and the floor fell out from beneath her, and Arisanna toppled into the darkness. For a brief moment the librarian hung in the air, their gut lurching with the sensation of falling. If she screamed, the sound was lost to the rushing air which whipped past her. Perhaps she fell for seconds. Perhaps she fell for hours. She couldn't tell in the darkness and the wind and the cold. All she could feel was the sickening, rending sensation of the wind lashing at her skin, and her navel behind dragged upwards, anchored to the tunnel she had once been confined to. Arisanna crashed into the ground with a sickening crunch as her nose broke against the floor, and frigid water rushed into her open mouth, choking her as it lapped at her sides and flooded her nostrils. She spluttered as the icy liquid froze her lungs, too cold to taste of anything and masking the sensation of her own blood flooding down the back of her throat. They wondered briefly if it would be easier to stay like this, face down in the water and slowly drowning. Would it be a better death than having to face starvation and lack of oxygen in the dark confines of the tunnel? Only it wasn't dark, Arisanna realized. Not anymore. Light pressed against her closed eyelids, and she lifted her face from the floor, blood and water streaming down her front and staining her clothes, her pale blue blouse already ruined by the onslaught of dirt and tears. Arisanna blinked away the water in their eyes and found themselves kneeling in an impossibly large chamber. Too large to be beneath the library, certainly. Too large to conceivably be under Paris. The room was a vast diamond, supported at each corner by brilliant white columns. The walls and ceilings were painted in spectacular murals of blue sky and clouds, idyllic illustrations of the heavens which threatened to rob the librarian of any breath she had left. It could have been a real sky, The true sky, which had abandoned her for these catacombs. Only it wasn't. It was too perfect to truly be the sky. All around her floated the lights, each no bigger than her palm, drifting freely through the air like hummingbirds, weaving between and around each other, each of them murmuring and chittering like excited animals in her presence. The space was gorgeous, truly divine in a way which burned her feverish mind to consider. And Arisanna found her imagination filled with images of ancient temples and shrines to the gods. The ideal of heaven and of worship and of temples, perfectly encapsulated and preserved deep within the earth, locked away from the unworthy gaze of man. She could feel the burden of its existence weighing down on her, crushing the life from her chest and the consciousness from her mind. And there, in the center of the infinite room, offset to the space's angles, was an altar, carved beautifully of marble and shimmering in the floating lights as their glow reflected from the water she now knelt in. They pulled themselves to their feet, water raining down from their clothes and disrupting the reflection of the murals around them, which made it appear as if they were floating within an endless reflected sky. Arisanna stepped towards the altar, her eyes landing on its surface. She saw now, as she moved closer, that chains wrapped around either side of the altar, lashing something dark upon its surface, holding it in place. They stepped closer again, and the mutterings of the lights became louder and more frantic as she approached. Laid across the surface of the altar was a book. The chains dug into the flesh of the worn, faded leather, and the mottled remains of golden gilding traced intricate patterns across the cover. Arisanna knew books. Her career was tending to books. She had spent her whole life around books. Yet still, this book seemed wrong. It was not merely that the presence of chains binding it to the altar unnerved her, but that the book itself radiated with an energy which made her insides churn and her breath catch in her chest. This book was not supposed to be here. Not underground in this forgotten chamber. Not beneath the library. Not on this plane of existence. Divine or damned, this book by its mere presence made Arisanna's skin tingle with electricity and made her tears feel hot against her face. Their feet pulled them closer, step after step through the water, until they were positioned directly over the book, peering down at its title, etched into the leather binding in a language they didn't read, but could recognize from so many manuscripts within the library. The language the Englishman had come searching for. The language she had guided him to. Around her, the lights were practically screaming now, yet the sound was all but lost to Arisanna, her attention now focused wholly on the book. The pages called to her, begging her to open them and peer upon the unreadable knowledge within. Arisanna ran her fingers gently across the chains which bound the book in place, and for just a moment her senses returned to her. Reality set in, and the unnatural situation filled her with such an intense fear it entirely crushed any sense of beauty and awe the room had inspired, and threatened to break her body and mind where she stood. This was wrong. She needed to leave, to find some way out before something worse happened to her. Before the book... A drop of blood fell from Arisanna's broken nose and splashed against the metal of the chains. With a deafening crack, the chains broke apart, unspooling as they crashed into the water. The cover of the book threw itself open, releasing a blast of light and sound, the force of which knocked the librarian to their knees. She screamed as the light which poured from within the book overtook their vision, blinding them in a world of brilliant white. Her tears burned against her skin, heated so intensely by the light that they scalded her flesh, steaming as it burned into her cheeks. The sound of millions of voices in unison beat into her skull, not the murmurings of the lights, but true, pained screaming, agonizing in their volume and intensity as they pierced her mind. Arisanna toppled forwards and gripped the dies, begging noiselessly for release from the pain as it enveloped her, clogging her throat with the heat and clouding her mind with impossible images. For a brief moment, the intensity of the light was broken by the cold, snaking feeling of something wrapping itself around her wrists, and then, as instantly as it had began, the light vanished, plunging Arisanna into the dark grasp of unconsciousness. She toppled back into the water, floating in a void of her own mind. A single word drifted into coherency, a name which had tied itself to her very being. Saraza. Arisanna did not know what the name meant. Addled with pain and fear, she could not even begin to think about the word. Then something else rang in her ears, spoken from an outside source far greater than herself. Another name. One she recognized even if she didn't want to. Oh yes, she recognized this name. It had been avoiding her for months now. Lomenthal. The soft voices of the lights hissed in her unconscious ears. William Lomenthal. The voices fell silent, and Arisanna let the emptiness swallow her soul.